The alarms did not scream. They whispered, which was worse. I was standing on the command deck of Watchpost Halden when the sky above the colony split open into 600 separate ships. Not one fleet, 600 individual points of light arranged in a pattern too perfect to be anything but a message. My name is Daniel Hart, and I was the lowest-ranked officer on that deck, which is the only reason I am alive to tell you what happened next. Nobody on Halden had ever seen a fleet that size. We had heard of the Concord, the old alliance of species who had been trading, ruling, and quietly steering the galaxy since before humans learned to split an atom. We had heard the stories. We had never expected to be visited by them directly, and certainly not like this. Admiral Marcus Cole was the first to speak, and his voice did not shake, though I could see his hand pressed flat against the console like he needed something solid to hold on to. "Get me a channel," he said. "Now." The comms officer beside me, a young woman named Claire Dawson, was already working the console before he finished the sentence. Her fingers moved fast, but her face had gone pale, the kind of pale that comes from understanding a threat before your body has caught up to your mind. "Channel open, sir," she said. The image that appeared on the main screen was not a face. It was a shifting geometric shape, layered in colors that did not exist in human vision until our translators forced them into something we could process. The voice that came through was flat, measured, and utterly without warmth. "Human colony designation Halden. This is Emissary Vantor Kale, speaking for the Concord of Elder Species. You are hereby summoned to present a representative for formal tribute negotiation. Failure to comply within one rotation will be considered an act of defiance against galactic order." I remember the silence that followed. Not fear exactly, something closer to disbelief. We had been part of the wider galactic community for less than 30 years. We had traded, we had listened, we had learned the customs of species older than our written history. Nobody had told us that tribute was part of the arrangement. Admiral Cole did not answer right away. He looked at Claire, then at me, then back at the screen. "Tribute for what?" he said. "For the privilege of stability," Vantor Kale replied. "For the protection the Concord extends to lesser species navigating a dangerous galaxy. Every species under our care contributes. Yours has enjoyed 30 years of peace without contribution. That debt is now due." I felt something tighten in my chest. I had grown up hearing about empires that demanded payment for peace they had never been asked to provide. I had read about wars fought over exactly this kind of arrangement, though I never imagined I would hear the same words spoken by something that looked like a floating crystal on a view screen. Cole kept his voice level, and if we decline to pay this tribute, then Halden and every human settlement in this system will be reclassified as non-compliant, Vantor Kale said. "Reclassification carries consequences. Trade routes will close. Support will be withdrawn. Further measures may follow, depending on the severity of your defiance." The word defiance hung in the air like smoke. "I need to speak with my government," Cole said. "This decision is not mine to make alone." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that machines and ancient beings use to make you feel small. "You have one rotation," Vantor Kale said. "A representative from your central authority will be expected to answer in person, aboard the Concord flagship. Choose wisely, Admiral. Many species have made the mistake of believing defiance was strength. None of them exist as independent voices any longer." The channel closed. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Cole turned to Claire. "Get me Ambassador Whitfield," he said, "immediately." Grace Whitfield was the closest thing humanity had to a face for the wider galaxy. She had been present at first contact. She had negotiated our earliest trade agreements. She had a reputation among alien diplomats for being calm in rooms where calm was in short supply, and for asking questions nobody else was willing to ask. It took nearly 4 hours to reach her through secure channels, and in that time, the fleet above Halden did not move an inch. It did not need to. 600 ships sitting motionless above a colony of 11,000 people said everything that needed saying. When Whitfield's face finally appeared on our screen, she looked like she had been woken from sleep, though her eyes were sharp and alert within seconds. "Tell me everything," she said. Cole gave her the full account, the ultimatum, the timeline, the threat buried inside the politeness of Vantor Kale's words. I stood near the back of the room, close enough to hear everything, and I watched Whitfield's expression shift from concern to something colder, something more focused. "They have done this before," she said quietly, almost to herself. "To other species. We have heard the reports. Nobody talks about what tribute actually costs long-term. Nobody talks about what happens to the species that agree." "What happens?" Cole asked. "They stop being independent," Whitfield said, slowly, quietly, one agreement at a time. She looked directly into the camera then, and I felt like she was looking at all of us, not just Cole. "I will go," she said. "I will answer for humanity myself." I did not know, standing on that deck, that I would be assigned to accompany her. I did not know that within 2 days I would be standing in a chamber built for creatures 10 times my size, translating for a woman about to make a decision that would ripple across 1,000 systems. I only knew, in that moment, that something had shifted in the room. The fear had not disappeared, but underneath it, something harder was beginning to form. 2 days later, I stood behind Ambassador Whitfield aboard the Concorde flagship, a vessel so large that our own ship could have fit inside a single docking bay with room to spare. The chamber we were led into was circular, ringed with representatives from species I recognized only from briefing documents. Tall, silver-skinned beings from a system near the galactic core. Squat, 4 armed traders known for controlling half the shipping lanes in this sector. Things that had no fixed shape at all, shifting slowly as they observed us with sensory organs I could not identify. At the center of the chamber stood Vantor Kale, in physical form now, tall and faceted like a living gemstone, catching the chamber's light in ways that made it difficult to look at directly for too long. "Ambassador Whitfield," Vantor Kale said, the translation software rendering the voice as calm and formal. "You have been given the terms. The Concorde requires your answer." I stood 2 steps behind Whitfield, my translation earpiece humming quietly, ready to render her words into the dozen or so relevant dialects the chamber required. My hands were sweating despite the climate-controlled air. I could feel 1,000 ancient eyes, sensors, and unknown organs fixed on the 2 of us, the newest species in the room, expected to bow to a system that had been running long before humanity built its first city. Whitfield stood straight, her hands folded in front of her, and did not flinch under the weight of that attention. "Before I answer," she said, "I want to understand the terms fully. What happens to a species that refuses?" A murmur passed through the chamber, something between amusement and disbelief. Vantor Kale's crystalline form shifted slightly, catching new angles of light. "No species has refused in recorded memory," the emissary said. "The question has not needed an answer." "Then let me be the first to ask it properly," Whitfield said. The chamber went quiet in a way that felt heavier than before. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Vantor Kale did not answer the question. Instead, the emissary turned slightly, addressing the wider chamber rather than Whitfield alone. "The Concorde does not ask twice," Vantor Kale said. "Ambassador, your answer, now, in front of this assembly." I watched Grace Whitfield take a slow breath. I watched her glance back at me for the briefest moment, not for permission, but as if to make sure I understood what she was about to do. Then she turned back to face 1,000 ancient eyes, and every representative of every species that had ever paid tribute to keep their small corner of the galaxy safe. She opened her mouth to answer. "No." The word landed in the chamber and did nothing at first. That was the strangest part. I had expected shouting, or alarms, or some dramatic shift in the lighting. Instead, there was only silence. And in that silence I understood something that took me a moment to put into words. Half the room had not understood what she said at all. Vantor Kale's crystalline form remained still for 3 full seconds, which for a being that processed information at speeds far beyond ours, was an eternity. "Clarify your response," the emissary said. "The translation may have failed." "The translation did not fail," Whitfield said. "My answer is no. Humanity will not pay tribute to the Concord. This time the murmur that swept the chamber was not amusement. It was confusion, sharp and immediate, rippling outward from species to species like a stone dropped into still water. I caught fragments of translated whispers through my earpiece, overlapping and colliding. Refusal without ritual, refusal without formal challenge, refusal without even the courtesy of anger. One of the four-armed traders near the edge of the chamber leaned toward a neighboring delegate and said something my earpiece rendered simply as, "They cannot mean it. Surely they do not understand what they are saying." I understood then why the silence had been so heavy. In this room, defiance was not a foreign concept. Species had raised their voices before, had postured, had threatened violence in the heat of a negotiation. What none of them had ever done, in any recorded memory the Concord possessed, was refuse calmly, refusal without spectacle, refusal that did not ask to be taken seriously because it already assumed it would be. Vantor Kale's voice, when it came again, had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "You do not comprehend the weight of what you are saying," the emissary said. "This is not a request that can be declined out of pride. The Concord's protection is not symbolic. Every species in this chamber depends on the stability our system provides. Your refusal endangers not only your own people, but the balance every other species has come to rely upon." Whitfield's voice remained even. "That is precisely why I am refusing. I need to explain something here, because I think it matters." Later, long after that day, people would ask me why humanity said no in such a plain, unremarkable way. They expected something grander, a speech, a declaration written for history books. What they did not understand was that the plainness was the point. Grace Whitfield had told me once, on the long journey to the flagship, that humans have a long memory for the word no. Not because we invented refusal, every species has some version of resistance, but because we have a specific cultural weight attached to saying it plainly, without decoration, in moments when everyone expects something more elaborate. She told me about old stories from human history, about soldiers surrounded on frozen battlefields who answered surrender demands with a single blunt word rather than a formal speech, because the blunt word carried more meaning than any speech could. She told me that humans understand instinctively that sometimes the smallest word, said without flinching, carries more weight than an entire declaration of war. I tried to explain this to the alien liaison assigned to walk beside me during the recess that followed, a being named Threl Osan, who represented one of the smaller trading species in the chamber. Threl Osan had 6 eyes arranged around a narrow head, and all 6 were fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel like I was being studied under a microscope. "Why did she not offer a counter-demand?" Threl Osan asked. "Why did she not propose an alternative arrangement, a smaller tribute, a delayed schedule?" That is how refusal works. You refuse the terms, not the entire concept. I understood the question. In this chamber, refusal was supposed to be a negotiating tool, a way of extracting better terms rather than actually walking away from the table. Nobody in that room, apparently, had ever refused something entirely, without offering something else in its place. "She is not negotiating the terms," I said. "She is refusing the entire premise. Humanity does not believe protection should come with a permanent bill attached." Threl Osan's eyes blinked in a staggered, uneven pattern that I had learned meant deep confusion. "But every species pays," Threl Osan said. "My people have paid for 400 years. It is simply the price of belonging to something larger than ourselves." "And has that price ever gone down?" I asked. "Has it ever been paid off?" Threl Osan did not answer, and the silence told me everything I needed to know. Back inside the chamber, the recess ended, and Vantor Kale addressed the full assembly once more, this time with a formality that felt colder than before. "The Concord has heard the human answer," the emissary said. "Let the record show that humanity, a species barely 30 years removed from its own homeworld, has rejected the protection and stability offered by every elder species present in this chamber. Let the record show the consequences that follow are the result of their own choice." Whitfield did not respond to the threat directly. Instead, she asked a question that I have thought about many times since. "Emissary Vantor Kale," she said, "how many species in this chamber have asked, even once, what happens to those who never pay off their debt?" The chamber went quiet again, and this time the quiet had a different texture. I looked around at the delegates, at species who had sat in this room for centuries, decades, generations, paying whatever the Concord asked without ever questioning where the payments went or when they might end. I saw, or thought I saw, something shift behind a few of those ancient alien eyes. Not agreement exactly, something closer to a question they had never allowed themselves to ask out loud. Vantor Kale did not answer the question either. "This assembly is concluded," the emissary said instead. "Humanity's status is hereby changed from provisional member to non-compliant entity. All associated consequences take immediate effect." We were escorted from the flagship without further conversation. I remember walking down the long corridor toward our shuttle, flanked by silent guards whose species I did not recognize, and I remember Whitfield's hand resting briefly on my shoulder as we walked. "They will not attack immediately," she said quietly, as if she could read the fear building in my chest. "They cannot." An immediate strike against a species that simply said no, with no formal challenge, no ritual violation, nothing but a calm refusal, would make every other tribute-paying species start asking the same question you ask Thrello-san: why do we keep paying? That question is more dangerous to the Concord than our entire fleet combined. I did not fully believe her at the time. I believed her more with each day that followed, as reports began arriving from across human space, and then from beyond it, carrying word of what had happened in that chamber. The story spread faster than any of us expected, faster than the Concord could control, faster even than our own government's official statements. By the time we returned to Halden, the fleet above the colony had not moved, but something else had changed. Ships from at least 3 other species, none of them part of the Concord's inner circle, had begun quietly reaching out through unofficial channels, asking questions nobody had dared ask before. Questions about the terms of their own tribute. Questions about whether refusal was actually possible. Questions about what one single word, spoken plainly by a species nobody had taken seriously, might mean for the rest of the galaxy. I did not know it then, standing on the observation deck of Watchpost Halden, watching 600 motionless ships hang above our colony like a held breath, but the word Grace Whitfield had spoken in that chamber was already traveling faster than light, faster than any message we could send on purpose, carried from species to species by nothing more than the simple, undeniable fact that someone had finally said it. 3 warships broke formation above Halden at exactly midnight colony time, and I was awake to see it happen. I had not slept properly since returning from the flagship. None of us had. Admiral Cole had moved a cot into the command room and refused to leave it, and Claire Dawson had taken to sleeping in short bursts at her console, headset still on, ready to catch any change in the fleet's behavior the instant it happened. I was there when the alert sounded, close enough to see the 3 ships peel away from the larger formation and begin a slow, deliberate descent toward the colony's upper atmosphere. Cole was on his feet before the alert finished its first cycle. "Report," he said. 3 vessels, Claire said, her voice tight but controlled. "Configuration matches heavy enforcement class. They are not hailing us. They are just moving." I felt my pulse climb. Enforcement class ships were not diplomatic vessels. Everything we had learned about the Concord's fleet structure told us these were the ships used to make examples of non-compliant species, quietly and without much ceremony. "Do we hail them?" Claire asked. "No," Cole said. "We wait. If they want a reaction, we do not give them one." I did not fully understand the wisdom of that decision until later, but in the moment, waiting felt unbearable. I watched the 3 ships descend on the main display, their outlines growing larger and more detailed as they crossed into a range where our sensors could resolve individual hull markings. They did not fire. They did not deploy anything. They simply came to a stop at the edge of our defense perimeter and held position, close enough that every person on Halden could look up and see them without instruments. three dark shapes blotting out a section of the night sky. An hour passed, then two. Cole refused to move, refused to blink first, refused to send any signal that might be read as either provocation or surrender. I stood near the back of the command deck, watching the silence stretch out like a held breath, and I understood, slowly, that this was its own kind of message. The Concorde was not attacking. The Concorde was demonstrating what attack would look like, without actually committing to it. At the 3-hour mark, one of the three ships opened a channel, unrequested. "This is Enforcement Vessel Threnody," a new voice said, colder and less formal than Vantor Kale's had been. "This is a warning demonstration. Compliance may still be offered. The window remains open for 48 hours before further measures are considered." Cole did not answer immediately. He looked at Claire, then at me, then at the display showing the three motionless ships. "Do not respond," he said finally. "Let the silence be our answer." I remember thinking, in that moment, that silence felt like a strange kind of courage, quieter than anything I had imagined bravery would look like. There was no speech, no defiant broadcast, just 11,000 people on a small colony, refusing to answer a threat with anything other than the fact that they were still there, still standing, still going about the business of living. The 48-hour window came and went. Nothing happened. The three enforcement ships remained at the edge of our perimeter, unmoving, and eventually rejoined the larger formation above the colony, as if the entire demonstration had simply been a rehearsal for something that never arrived. I asked Cole about it afterward, once the tension in the command room had eased enough for conversation. "Why didn't they attack?" I asked. "They had the ships. They had every advantage." Cole rubbed his eyes, the exhaustion of the past few days finally showing on his face. "Because attacking us would prove Whitfield's question right," he said. "If they strike a species for saying no, with no formal violation, no broken agreement, nothing but a refusal spoken plainly in a public chamber, every other species watching would learn exactly what kind of protection the Concorde actually offers. They cannot afford that lesson to spread. Not yet. Not while other species are still asking the same questions we are." I thought about Threll Asan then, the six-eyed liaison who had asked me why Whitfield had not offered a counter-demand. I wondered whether that question was still echoing somewhere in Threll Asan's own mind, whether other delegates across other systems were lying awake the way we had, turning over the same uncomfortable arithmetic. Within days, the answer to that question became clear, though not in the way any of us expected. A small trading vessel from a species called the Illyray arrived at Halden's outer boundary, requesting permission to dock. The Illyray were not part of the inner Concorde circle, but they had paid tribute for as long as anyone could remember, a smaller and quieter species known for staying out of larger conflicts. Their arrival was unannounced, and Cole was reluctant to allow it, given everything hanging above our heads. Whitfield convinced him otherwise. "If they are risking a visit to us right now," she said, "it is because something has changed for them too. We should hear what they have to say before we decide it is a trap." The Illyray delegation was small, just 2 representatives, led by an elder named Senek Oru, whose species communicated through a series of low resonant tones that our translators rendered into careful, measured English. Senek Oru sat across from Whitfield in a private meeting room, hands folded in a gesture that seemed almost human in its nervousness. "We have paid tribute for 300 years, Senek Oru said. "We were told, generations ago, that the debt would eventually be settled, that a final payment existed somewhere in the future. No one among us has ever seen that final payment arrive. No one among us has ever been permitted to ask when it might." Whitfield listened without interrupting. The same patience I had seen her use in the Concorde chamber now turned toward this quieter, more fragile conversation. "And now," she said gently. "And now," Senek Oru said, "our elders have heard what your ambassador said in that chamber. A single word, no embellishment, no ritual challenge, just refusal, spoken as though it required no justification at all. We did not know that was permitted. We did not know anyone had ever considered it permitted." I watched Whitfield's expression carefully as Senek Oru spoke, and I saw something there that was not triumph, Not satisfaction, but something quieter and more serious. The weight of understanding exactly what had been set in motion. "I cannot tell you what to do," Whitfield said. "I can only tell you what we decided, and why. The rest is yours to decide." Senek Oru did not answer right away. When the elder finally spoke again, the words carried a different kind of resonance, one that even I, without full understanding of Ilare vocal patterns, could recognize as something like resolve, forming out of long-held uncertainty. "We are not asking for your help," Senek Oru said. "We are asking whether, if we choose to ask our own question in our own chamber, humanity will still be standing when we look for you afterward." Whitfield did not hesitate. "We will be standing," she said. "That much I can promise." The Ilare delegation left Halden 2 days later, their small trading vessel slipping quietly back through the fleet, still hovering above our colony, unremarkable to any casual observer, carrying nothing more than words, and the memory of a conversation that would not stay contained within that single meeting room. I did not know it then, but the visit from Senek Oru was only the first. Within the following weeks, similar quiet requests began arriving from species we had barely heard of, each one carrying the same unspoken question beneath the surface of their formal language. Had anyone actually tried refusing? Had anyone actually survived it? I began to understand, slowly, that the fleet above Halden was no longer simply a threat aimed at us. It had become something else entirely, a kind of unintentional monument, visible from the ground, visible from orbit, visible to every passing ship that came near enough to see it. 600 vessels, still holding position, still waiting for a surrender that had not come, and as the days stretched on, increasingly looked like it never would. The message arrived from a system I had never heard of, and it nearly caused a diplomatic collapse before Cole had even finished reading it aloud. I was assigned by then to a small monitoring team responsible for tracking transmissions moving through the region, a job that had started as routine and had become, in the span of a few weeks, one of the strangest assignments I had ever held. Every day brought new signals, new questions, new species reaching out through channels the Concorde had never bothered to monitor closely, because no one had ever used them for anything except trade schedules and weather reports. Admiral Cole called an emergency briefing at 4 in the morning colony time, and I stood at the back of the room again, the same position I always seemed to end up in moments like these, close enough to hear everything, junior enough that nobody expected me to speak. "This came in an hour ago," Cole said, gesturing at the display, "encrypted through 3 relay points before it reached us. It is from a species called the Draveth. They control roughly 40 independent systems near what the Concorde calls the Outer Reach." I had heard of the Draveth only in passing, a species known for staying almost entirely outside galactic politics, keeping to themselves, trading only when necessary, and otherwise avoiding contact with the wider community. For them to reach out at all was unusual. For them to reach out through encrypted relayed channels suggested something closer to desperation. "What does it say?" Whitfield asked. Cole read the message aloud, and I remember every word of it, because it was the first time I understood exactly how far the ripple had already traveled. "To the species that refused," the message began, "we have watched the Concorde's fleet remain motionless above your colony for weeks now. We have watched them fail to act on their own threat. Our elders have debated for 3 generations whether resistance was possible, and have always concluded that it was not, because no one had ever tried and lived to tell us what happened next. You have lived. We would like to know how." The room was silent after Cole finished reading. Whitfield was the first to speak. "They are not asking for military help," she said. "They are asking for proof that it can be done. That is more dangerous to the Concorde than a fleet," Cole said quietly. "A fleet. They know how to fight. An idea spreading between 40 independent systems, they have no defense against that at all." Within the same week, 3 more messages arrived, each from a different corner of the galaxy, each carrying some version of the same question. A species called the Ophani, known for their control of a major shipping corridor, wanted to know whether refusal had to be absolute or whether partial refusal was possible. a quiet agricultural species near the galactic rim, name rendered by our translators as the Committee of Seven Valleys, wanted to know what resources humanity had used to prepare for the consequences of refusal, assuming, correctly, that some preparation must have existed. And a message arrived from within the Concord's own territory, from a lesser delegate named Ivan Kor, who had apparently been present in the chamber the day Whitfield gave her answer, and who now wrote privately, carefully, asking whether the offer of information extended even to those who served the Concord directly. Whitfield answered every message personally, and I was assigned to help translate and format the responses, which meant I read each exchange in full, and slowly began to understand the shape of what was happening around us. She did not promise military support to anyone. She did not offer alliances or treaties. What she offered, again and again, was something simpler and in some ways more unsettling to the old order than any fleet could have been. She offered the plain observation that humanity had said no and was still standing, still trading, still living exactly as it had before, weeks later, with no invasion, no punishment, nothing but a fleet of 600 ships parked uselessly overhead, unable to justify the one action that would have ended the conversation entirely. The Concord noticed. Of course they noticed. 3 weeks after the message from the Dravith arrived, Van Torquale requested a private channel with Whitfield, no chamber, no assembly, no witnesses beyond the two of them and whoever they each chose to have present. I was asked to attend as translator, though by that point Whitfield barely needed my help. She had spent enough time studying Concord communication patterns that she understood most of what was said before I finished rendering it. "You understand what you have done," Van Torquale said, and for the first time since I had met the emissary, the crystalline voice carried something that was not quite anger, but close to it. 42 species have opened unofficial inquiries regarding the terms of their tribute agreements in the past month alone. 6 have formally requested renegotiation. This has never happened in recorded Concord history. Whitfield's expression did not change. "I only answered a question honestly," she said. "What other species choose to ask themselves afterward is not something I control." "You could stop this," Van Torquale said. "A public statement, a clarification that your refusal was specific to unique circumstances, not a general precedent. It would ease tensions considerably. It would allow the Concord to manage this situation without further disruption." "And in exchange?" Whitfield asked. "In exchange, the Concord would consider revising the terms initially offered to humanity," Van Torquale said. "A reduced tribute, perhaps, in time, an exemption entirely, provided the wider narrative is controlled." I watched Whitfield sit with that offer for a long moment, and I understood, watching her, that this was the actual test, the one the Chamber Assembly had merely been a preview for. Not whether humanity could withstand a fleet sitting overhead, whether humanity could withstand being offered exactly what it wanted, in exchange for taking that same freedom away from every species that had started asking questions because of us. "No," she said again, and this time the word carried a different weight than it had in the chamber, quieter, more personal, but no less absolute. "You would trade the freedom of 42 species for your own comfort," Van Torquale said, and there was something almost like disbelief in the translated tone. "I would not trade anyone's freedom for anything," Whitfield said. "That includes ours. If the Dravith, the Ophani, the Illyray, and everyone else asking these questions decide the answer is worth pursuing, that is their choice to make, and I will not take that choice away from them, just to make my own position easier." Van Torquale did not respond immediately. When the emissary finally spoke again, the voice had lost the last of its earlier authority, replaced by something that sounded, even through the imperfect translation, almost like resignation. "Then, this will not end quietly," Van Torquale said. "It was never going to end quietly," Whitfield replied. "It only needed to begin honestly." The channel closed, and for a long moment neither Whitfield nor I said anything. I finally broke the silence with the question that had been building in me for days. "What happens now?" I asked. Whitfield looked at me, and for the first time since the chamber, I saw something in her expression that looked almost like fear, quickly buried beneath the calm she always wore in front of others. Now we find out whether 42 species are brave enough to finish what one word started, she said. Within days, the answer began arriving, not from the Concorde, but from the systems themselves. The Ophani closed their major shipping corridor to Concorde enforcement vessels, citing a sudden and unexplained maintenance schedule that everyone understood was neither sudden nor about maintenance. The Committee of Seven Valleys quietly stopped their tribute shipments entirely, offering no explanation at all, simply allowing the silence to speak for itself, the same way Cole had once told me to let our own silence answer a threat. The Dravith, cautious as ever, made no dramatic gesture, but sent one final message to Halden, short and direct. "We have decided," it read. "We will ask our own question, in our own chamber, when the time comes. Thank you for showing us it was possible to ask at all." I stood on the observation deck that night, looking up at the same 600 ships that had hung motionless above our colony for what felt like a lifetime, and for the first time since they arrived, I did not feel afraid of them. I felt something closer to certainty, the quiet, steady kind that comes from watching an old and unquestioned system begin, slowly and unmistakably, to crack under the weight of a single honest word. The fleet above Halden began to move on the 90th day, and for the first time since they arrived, I felt certain something final was about to happen. I had grown used to the sight of those 600 ships hanging in our sky, so used to it that colony children had started drawing them in chalk on the walkways, so used to it that market vendors had begun naming pastries after Vantor Kale as a small, quiet act of defiance disguised as humor. So when the formation shifted, breaking its long stillness for the first time in 3 months, every alarm on Halden went off at once, and I found myself running to the command deck before I had even fully processed why. Cole was already there, along with Whitfield, who had taken up near permanent residence on the station by that point, unwilling to be anywhere else while the situation remained unresolved. "Report," Cole said, though his voice had none of the sharp fear it carried the first night the fleet arrived. 3 months of watching had worn the edge off that particular kind of panic, replacing it with something steadier, more practiced. "They are not advancing," Claire Dawson said, her eyes fixed on the display. "They are reorganizing. Formation pattern suggests withdrawal, not attack." Nobody moved for a long moment, as if speaking too soon might undo whatever was happening on the screen. I watched the 600 points of light slowly rearrange themselves, drawing inward, forming up into travel configuration, the same pattern ships used when preparing to leave a system rather than commit to one. "They are leaving," Whitfield said quietly, and there was something in her voice I had not heard before. Not quite relief, something closer to disbelief, that the thing she had been fighting for so long might actually be ending. A channel request came through moments later, and this time it was not Vantor Kale on the other end. The face, or the shape that served as a face, belonged to someone new, someone whose crystalline structure carried deeper, older colors than the emissary we had grown used to negotiating with. "I am Speaker Halvin Threll," the voice said, carrying a different weight than Vantor Kale's had, less mechanical certainty, more careful deliberation. "I speak now for the full Concord Assembly, not a single emissary. We wish to open new terms with humanity." Cole glanced at Whitfield, who stepped forward to answer. "I am listening," she said. "The tribute demand is withdrawn," Halvin Threll said, and I heard the words land in the room like something physical, a weight lifting that none of us had realized we were still carrying. Furthermore, given the scale of disruption that has followed your initial refusal, the Concorde finds itself required to reconsider the tribute structure as a whole. Whitfield did not smile, did not celebrate, simply waited, letting the silence draw out the rest of the explanation. 47 species have formally withdrawn from tribute obligations in the past 2 months, Halvin Threll continued. 6 others have opened renegotiation. 2 have left the Concorde entirely, seeking independent status. This was never the outcome anyone anticipated from a single, small, newly contacted species declining an invitation to a chamber assembly. It was never about being small, Whitfield said. It was about whether the terms were fair in the first place. Once that question was asked honestly, the answer became difficult to unhear, for anyone. Halvan Threll's crystalline form shifted slightly, and though I could not read alien expressions with any real confidence, something in that movement felt, to me, like the closest thing to acknowledgement I had seen from the Concord in 3 months. The Assembly wishes to know, Halvan Threll said, whether humanity would be willing to participate in restructuring the wider system, not as a subordinate member, as an equal voice in determining what fair cooperation between species actually looks like, going forward. I watched Whitfield consider the offer carefully, none of the rushed relief I might have expected from someone who had spent 3 months standing beneath the shadow of 600 warships. "We would be willing to participate," she said finally, "on one condition. Every species currently paying tribute, and every species that has ever paid it, is given the same chance to ask the question I asked in that chamber, not privately, not quietly, openly, in front of the same assembly that heard my answer." There was a long pause before Halvan Threll responded. "That is a significant request," the speaker said. "It is the only request that matters," Whitfield replied. "A system that only survives by preventing its members from asking honest questions was never stable to begin with. If the new arrangement cannot withstand honesty, it does not deserve to replace the old one." Halvan Threll did not answer immediately, and for a moment I thought the offer might collapse entirely under the weight of that condition. Then, slowly, the speaker's voice returned, quieter than before. "It will be granted," Halvan Threll said. "The Assembly will reconvene within 1 rotation. All species, tribute-paying and otherwise, will be permitted to speak freely regarding the terms of their continued participation." The channel closed, and the command deck erupted into something I had never expected to witness on Watchpost Halden. Quiet, disbelieving celebration, the kind that comes not from victory in battle, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that a threat you had learned to live beneath for months had simply, finally, lifted. I did not fully understand the scale of what had happened until weeks later, when I sat in on the reconvened Concord Assembly as part of the human delegation. This time, not as a nervous junior officer trailing behind an ambassador, but as someone trusted enough to help draft the new framework being proposed. I watched species after species rise to speak, some hesitantly, some with a confidence that clearly surprised even themselves, each one asking some version of the same question Whitfield had first posed in that chamber months earlier. What happens to those who never pay off their debt? Nobody avoided the question this time. Nobody was permitted to. Senik Oru was there, representing the Ilare, and found me during a recess in the proceedings, 6 eyes settling on me with an expression I had come to recognize, over the months, as something like gratitude, though Ilare physiology rarely allowed for anything so simple. "We ask our question," Senik Oru said, "in our own chamber, as I told your ambassador we would." "And?" I asked. "And we are still standing," Senik Oru said, the same words Whitfield had once promised, now returned to us from another species entirely, carried across the distance between systems by nothing more than the plain fact that someone had proven it possible first. I thought often, in the months that followed, about the shape of what had actually happened. Not a war, not a battle, not even, in any traditional sense, a negotiation. Just a single word, spoken plainly, without decoration, by a woman who understood that sometimes the smallest answer carries the most weight, precisely because it refuses to explain itself, refuses to soften itself into something more palatable, refuses to ask permission to exist. Grace Whitfield never described herself as someone who changed the galaxy. She always said, whenever anyone asked, that she had simply answered a question honestly, and the rest had been the choice of every other species who heard that answer and decided to ask their own question afterward. I believed her, mostly. But I also remembered standing in that chamber, translation earpiece humming, watching 1,000 ancient eyes fix on 2 small figures from a species barely 30 years removed from its own homeworld, and I remembered the silence that followed her answer, the silence of an entire system built on an assumption nobody had ever tested, cracking quietly under the weight of 2 simple letters. Years later, when new students of galactic history asked me to explain what had actually changed that day, I found myself giving the same answer every time, the only answer that ever felt complete. Nothing about the galaxy's power had changed. Humanity had not built a larger fleet. We had not discovered some hidden weapon capable of forcing an ancient alliance into submission. What changed was smaller than that, and far more permanent. An entire galaxy had been operating for centuries under the quiet assumption that refusal was impossible, that tribute was simply the unspoken cost of existing among older, more powerful neighbors. All it took to break that assumption was one honest answer, spoken without apology, by someone willing to stand in a room built for creatures far larger than herself, and mean it completely. I still think about that word sometimes. On quiet nights when the sky above Halden is empty and calm, nothing left overhead but ordinary stars. 2 letters, no decoration, no explanation, just the plainest, steadiest sound a human voice can make, delivered at exactly the moment an entire galaxy needed to hear it. Number. That was all it ever took to begin.